Chapter 10. Ma made me a cap out of my first coon hide, and I was proud of it, as Pa would have been if someone had given him a dozen Missouri mules. Ma said afterwards that she wished she hadn't made it for me because in some way wearing that cap must have affected my mind, because I went kind of coon crazy. I was out after ringtails every night. About the only time I didn't go hunting was when the weather was bad, and even then Ma all but had to hog-tie me. And what wonderful nights they were, running like deer through the thick timber of the bottoms, tearing my way through stands of wild cane and climbing over drifts, jumping logs and running and screaming and yelling, "Woo-wee, get 'em, boy, get 'em," following the voices of my little hounds. It wasn't too hard for a smart old coon to fool old Dan, but there was none that prowled the river banks that could fool my little Ann. As Grandpa had predicted, the price of coon skins jumped sky high. A good-sized hide was worth from $4 to $10, depending on the grade and quality. I kept the side of our smokehouse plastered with hides. Of course, I could spread them out a little more to cover more space. I always stretched them on the side facing the road, never on the back side. I wanted everyone in the country to see them. The money earned from my furs was turning over to my father. I didn't care about it. I had what I wanted, my dogs. And I suppose that Pa was saving it for something, because I never saw anything new turn up around our home, but like any young boy, I didn't care and I asked no questions. My whole life was wrapped up in my dogs. Everywhere I went, they went along. There was only one place I didn't want to go with them, and that was to Grandpa's store. Other dogs were always there, and it seemed that as if they wanted to jump on old Dan. It got so about the only time I went to see my grandfather was when I had a bundle of fur to take to the store. There was always a problem. In every way I could, I would try and slip away from my dogs. Sometimes I swore they could read my mind. It made no difference what I tried, I couldn't fool them. One time I was sure I had outsmarted them. The day before I was to make one of my trips, I took my furs off the barn and hid them. The next morning I hung around the house for a while and then nonchalantly whistling my way out of the barn. I climbed up to the loft and peeked through a crack, and I could see them laying there in front of their doghouse. They weren't even looking my way. Taking my furs, I sneaked out through a back door, and walking like a tomcat I made for the timber. I climbed a small dogwood tree and looked back. They were still there and didn't seem to know what I had done. Feeling just about as smart as Sherlock Holmes, I headed for the store. I was walking along singing my lungs out when they came tearing out from under the brush, wiggling and twisting and tickled to death to be with me. At first I was mad, but one look at dancing little Ann and all was forgiven. I sat down on my bundle of fur and laughed till I hurt all over, but I could no more have whipped one of them than I could have kissed a girl. After all, a boy just doesn't whip his dogs. Grandpa always counted my furs carefully and marked something down on a piece of paper. I never seen him do this with other hunters, and it got the best of my curiosity. One day while he was writing, I asked him, "Why you doing that, Grandpa?" He looked at me over his glasses and said kind of sharp, "Oh, never mind, I got my reasons." When Grandpa talked to me like that, I didn't push things any further. Besides, it didn't make any difference to me if he marked every piece of paper in the store. I always managed to make my trips on Saturdays, as that was coon hunters' day. I didn't have to stand around on the outside of the circle anymore and listen to coon hunters. I'd get right up in the middle and say my piece with the rest of them. I didn't have to tell any whoppers, for some of the things my dogs did were almost unbelievable anyhow. Oh, I guess I did make things a little bigger than they actually were, but I never did figure a coon hunter was honest to goodness. He just kind of stretched things a little bit. I could hold those coon hunters spellbound with some of my hunting tales. Grandpa would never say anything while I was telling my stories. He just puttered around the store with a silly little grin on his face. Once in a while, when I got too far off the beaten path, he'd come around and cram a bar of soap in my pocket. My face would get all kind of red, and I'd cut my story short and then fly out the door and head for home. The coon hunters were always kidding me about my dogs. Some of the remarks I heard made me fighting mad. Well, I never saw a hound so small, but I guess they're hounds. At least they look like it, though. Another would say, well, I don't believe little Ann is half as smart as he says she is. She's so little those old coons would think she's a rabbit. I bet she sneaks right up to them before they realize she's even a dog. Well, some of them nights a big old coon is going to carry her off to his den and raise some little coon puppies. I always took their kidding with a smile on my face, but it made my blood boil like the water in Ma's tea kettle. I had one way of shutting them up. Well, let's go look in the store, I'd say, and let's see who has the most hides in there. It was true that my dogs were small, especially little Ann. She could walk underneath an ordinary hound. In fact, she was a regular midget. If it had not been for her long ears, no one would have told her that she was a hound. Her actions weren't those of a hunting hound. She was constantly playing. She would play with our chickens and young calves with a piece of paper or a corn cob. What my little girl lacked in size, she made up in sweetness. She could make friends with a tomcat. Old Dan was just the opposite. He strutted around with a belligerent, tough attitude. Although he wasn't a tall dog, he was heavy. His body was long, and his broad chest was thick. His legs were short, big, and solid, and the muscles in his body were hard and knotty, and when he walked, they'd twist and jerk under his skin. He was a friendly dog. There was no strangers to him. He loved everyone. Yet he was a strange dog. He would not hunt with another hound, other than little Ann, or another hunter, not even my father. The strangest thing about old Dan was that he would not hunt, even with me, unless little Ann was with him. I found that out the first night I tried it. Little Ann had cut her pad on her right foot on a sharp, jagged flint rock. It was a nasty cut. I made a little boot of leather and put it on her wounded foot. To keep her from following me, I locked her in the corn crib. 2 nights later, I decided to take old Dan hunting for a while. He followed me down to the river bottom and then disappeared into the thick timber. Well, I waited and waited for him to strike a trail, and nothing happened. After about 2 hours, I called to him, and he didn't come. I called and called. Disgusted, I gave up and went home. Coming up through the barn lot, I saw him rolled up in a ball on the ground in front of the corn crib. It was then I immediately understood. I walked over and opened the door, and he jumped up in the crib, smelled little Ann's foot, twisted around in the shucks, and then lay down by her side. As he looked at me, I read this message in his friendly gray eyes. You could have done this a long time ago. I never did know if little Ann would hunt by herself or not. I'm sure she would have, for she was smart and an understanding dog, but I never tried to figure it out. Little Ann was my sister's pet. They rubbed and scratched and petted her, and they'd take her down to the creek and give her baths, and she loved all of it. If Ma wanted a chicken caught, she would just call little Ann. She would run the chicken down and hold it with her paws until Mother came. Not one feather would be harmed. Ma tried old Dan once. Before she got the chicken, there wasn't much left but feathers. By this strange twist of fate, little Ann was destined to go through life without being a mother. Perhaps it was because she was stunted in growth, or maybe it was because she was the runt in a large litter. There may have been something to do with that. During the first season, November through February, I had given complete freedom from work. Many times when I came home, the sun was high in the sky, and after each hunt, I always took care of my dogs. The flint rocks and sawbriars were hard on their feet, and with a bottle of peroxide and a can of salve, I'd doctor the wounds. I never knew what to expect from old Dan. I never saw a coonhound so determined, or one that could get into so many predicaments. More than one time, it would have been the death of him if he hadn't been for the old smart little Ann. One night, not long after I had entered into the bottoms, my dog struck the trail of an old boar coon. He was a smart old fellow and had a sack full of tricks. He'd cross the river time after time, and then finally swim into the middle and staying in the swift current, he swam downstream. Knowing he'd have to come out somewhere, my dogs split up. Old Dan took the right side and Little Ann worked the other, and I came out of the bottoms onto the gravel bar and stood and watched them in the moonlight. Little Ann worked downriver. Then she came up. I saw her when she passed me going up the bank, sniffing and scratching for the trail. She came back to me, and I patted her on the head and scratched her ears and talked to her. She kept staring across the river to where old Dan was searching for the trail. She waded in and swam across to help him. I knew the coon had not come up on the river on her side. If he had, she would have found the trail. I came up to a riffle and pulling off my shoes, waded across. My dogs worked the river bank up and down. They circled far out onto the bottoms, and I could hear the loud snuffling of old Dan. He was bewildered and mad, and I was getting a thrill of it all, as I'd never seen them fooled like this. Old Dan gave up on his side, piled into the river, and swam across the side Little Ann had worked. Well, I knew it would be useless for him to do that. I was on the point of giving up and calling him to me and going somewhere else to hunt, where I'd heard a bawl of Little Ann. Well, I couldn't believe what I heard. She wasn't bawling on a trail, she had the sound of a tree bark. Well, I hurried over down to the bank. There was a loud splash, and I saw old Dan swimming back, and by this time Little Ann was really singing a song. In the bright moonlight I could see old Dan clearly. His powerful front legs were churning the water. And then I saw a sight that makes a hunter's heart swell with pride. Still swimming, old Dan raised his head high out of the water and bawled. He couldn't wait until he reached the bank to tell Little Ann that he was coming. From far out in the river, he told her. Reaching the shallows, he plowed out of the river and onto the sandbar, not even taking the time to shake the water from his body. Again he raised his head and bawled and tore out up the bank. In a trot I followed, whooping to let them know that I was coming, and before I reached the tree, old Dan's deep voice was making the timber shake. The tree was a large birch, standing right on the bank of the river. The swift current had eaten away at the footing, causing it to lean. The lower branches of the tree dangled into the water. I saw how the smart old coon had pulled his trick. Coming in towards the bank from midstream, he'd caught the dangling limbs and climbed up. Exhausted from the long swim, he stayed there in the birch, thinking that he had outsmarted my dogs. I couldn't understand how Little Ann had found him. It was impossible to fell the tree towards the bottoms. It was too much off balance. I did the next best thing. I cut a long elder switch, unbuckled in one of my suspenders. I tied it to the end and climbed up the tree. The coon was sitting in a fork of a limb. Taking my switch, I whopped him a good one, and out he came. He sailed out over the river, and with a loud splash he hit the water and swam for the other side. My dogs jumped up off the bank after him. They were no match against his expert swimming. On reaching the other bank, he ran downriver. Climbing down out of the tree, I picked up my axe and lantern and trotted down to another riffle and then waded across there. I could tell with the bawling of my dogs that they were close to the coon. He would have to climb a tree or be caught on the ground. All at once, their voices stopped. I stood still and waited for them to bawl treed. Nothing happened. Thinking that the coon had taken to the river again, I waited to give them time to reach the opposite bank, and I waited and I waited. I could hear nothing. By then I knew he had not crossed over. I thought perhaps they had caught him on the ground, and I hurried on. I came to the point where a slough of crystal clear water ran into the river. On the other side was a bluff, and I could hear one of my dogs was over there. As I watched and waited, I heard a dog jump in the water. It was Little Ann. She swam across and came up to me. Staying with me for a minute, she then jumped into the slough and swam back to the other side. I could hear her sniffing and whining. I couldn't figure out where old Dan was. By squatting down and holding the lantern high over my head, I could dimly see the opposite bank. Little Ann was running up and down. I noticed she always stayed in one place about 25 yards, never leaving that small area. She ran down to the water's edge and stared out into the slough. The terrible thought came that old Dan had drowned. I knew a big coon was capable of drowning a dog in water by climbing on his head and forcing him under. As fast as I could run, I circled the slough. Climbing up the bluff, I came down to where little Ann was, and she was hysterical, running up and down the bank and whining. I tied my lantern onto a long pole and held it over the water, looking for old Dan's body. I could clearly see the clear spring waters, but I couldn't see my dog anywhere, and I sat down on the bank and buried my face in my hands, and I cried. I was sure he was gone. Several minutes passed, and all that time little Ann had never stopped. Running here and there along the bank, she kept sniffing and whining. I heard when she started digging. I looked around. She was 10 feet from the water's edge, and I got up and went over to her. She was digging in a small hole, about the size of a big apple. It was the air hole for a muskrat down. I pulled little Ann away from the hole and knelt down and put my ear to it, and I could hear something like a vibration in the ground. It was an eerie sound, and sounded seemed something that come from far away. I listened, and finally I understood what the noise was. It was the voice of old Dan. Little Ann had opened the hole up just enough with her digging so his voice could be heard faintly. In some way, he'd gotten into that old muskrat den. I knew that down under the bank in the water, the entrance to the den could be found. Rolling up my sleeve, I tried to find it with my hand. I had no luck. It was too far down. There was only one thing left to do. Leaving my axe and the lantern, I ran for home, and picking up a long-handled shovel, I hurried back. The sun was high in the sky before I had dug old Dan out. He was a sight to see. Nothing but mud from tip nose to the tip of his tail. I held on to his collar and let him down to the river to wash him off. The water there was much warmer than the cold spring water of the slough, and after washing him, I turned him loose. Right back into the hole he ran. Little Ann was already digging. I knew the coon was still in there. Working together, we dug him out. After the coon was killed, I saw what had made him so smart. His right front foot was twisted and shriveled. At one time, he had been caught in a trap, and he had pulled himself free. He was an old coon. His face was almost white. He was big and heavy and had beautiful fur. Tired, muddy, wet, and hungry, I started for home. I've always wondered how old Dan had gotten into that old muskrat den. Perhaps there was another entrance I had overlooked. I'll never know. One night, far back in the mountains, in a place called the Cyclone Timber, old Dan really pulled a good one. Many years before my time, a terrible cyclone had ripped its way through the mountains, leaving its scar in the form of fallen timber and twisted and tar-snarled. The path of the cyclone was several miles wide and several miles long. It was a wonderful place to hunt, as it was abound with game. My dogs had struck a trail of a coon about an hour before, and they had really been warming him up. I always knew it was about time to take him up a tree, and sure enough, I heard the deep voice of old Dan telling the world that he had a coon up a tree. I trotted along, going to them, when his voice stopped, and I could hear little Ann, but not old Dan. I wondered why, and was a little scared, for I knew something had happened. And then I heard his voice. It seemed louder than it had been before, and I felt better. When I came up to the tree, I thought little Ann had treed old Dan. She was sitting on her haunches, staring up and bawling the tree bark, and there, a good 15 feet from the ground, with his hind legs planted firmly in the center of a big limb, and his front paws against the trunk of the tree, stood old Dan, bawling for all he was worth. Above him, about 8 to 9 feet, was a baby coon. I was glad it was a young one, for if it had been an old one, he would have jumped out, and old Dan would have likely followed and probably would have broken all of his legs. From where I was standing, I could see it was impossible for old Dan to have climbed the tree. He was dead, and more of an old snag than a tree, with limbs that were crooked and twisted. The bark had rotted away and fallen off, leaving the trunk bare and slick as glass. It was a good 10 feet up to the first limb. I couldn't figure out how old Dan had climbed that tree. There had to be a solution somewhere. Walking around the other side, I saw how he had accomplished his feat. There in the bottom was a large hole. The old tree was hollow. Stepping back, I looked up and I could see another hole, which had been hidden from me because of old Dan's body. He'd simply crawled into the hole at the bottom and then climbed up the hollow tree and worked his way out onto the limb. In some way he had turned around and reared up, placing his front feet against the trunk, and there he was. Well, I didn't know what to do. I couldn't cut the tree down, and I was afraid to climb in for fear I'd scare the coon into jumping out, and if he did, old Dan would jump too and break his legs. Well, I ran plan after plan around in my mind. Nothing seemed to work, and then finally I came to the conclusion that I had to climb that tree and get a hold of that crazy dog. I blew up my lantern, pulled off my shoes and socks, and started shinnying up the tree. I prayed that coon wouldn't jump out. Inching along, being as quiet as I could, I made my way up to old Dan and grabbed his collar. I sat down on the limb and held him tight. He'd bawl now and then, but all burst my eardrums, and I couldn't drop him to the ground, and I couldn't climb down with him. I couldn't sit there on that limb and hold him all night. I would be no better off when daylight came either. Glancing at the hole at my side gave me a solution to my problem. I thought, if he came out of that hole, he can go back in it. That was the way I got my dog down from that tree. This had its problems too. In the first place, old Dan didn't want to be put in that hole head first. By scolding and pushing and shoving and squeezing, I finally got him started on his way. And like a fool, I sat there on the limb, waiting to see him come out on the bottom, and come out he did. Turning around, bawling as he did, he came right back up the hole. Well, there was nothing I could do but sit and wait. I understand why his voice had stopped for a while. He just had to take some time to climb a tree. While putting my ear in the hole, I could hear him coming, grunting and clawing as he come. Well, I helped him out of the hole and turned him around, and then crammed him back in. That time I wasn't too gentle with my work. I was tired of sitting on the limb, and my bare feet was getting cold. I started down the same time he did, and he beat me down. Looking over my shoulder, I saw him turn around and head back for the hole, and I wasn't far from the ground, so I let go. The flint rocks didn't feel too good on my feet when I landed, and I jumped in the hole just in time to grab the tip end of his long tail as it disappeared. I grabbed it. Holding on with one hand, I worked his feet down with the other, and then I pulled him out. I stopped his tree climbing by cramming rocks and chunks into the hole. And how that coon stayed in the tree I'll never know, but stay he did. And with a well-aimed rock I scared him out, and old Dan satisfied his lust for the kill. I started for home. I had had all the hunting I had wanted for that night. End of chapter 10.